Hello and welcome to Pathways, where you are invited to join me for a visit with leaders in personal and cultural transformation. This is your host, Paul O'Brien. These days, there's no doubt we live in a fearful world. Maybe we always have, but nowadays there are so many things to be anxious about. And lest we forget, the news media is ever ready to remind us, get us stirred up, and sell us tranquilizing drugs. This is a bad mental environment for everybody, especially including our children. It's essential that children have safe, secure environments in which to grow, learn, and develop healthy brains and bodies. Dealing with fears is a normal part of child development, of a child trying to make sense of the world and the way it works. It's also a natural mechanism to help us keep safe. But fears can also cause a lot of distress for the kids and teens, and parents often worry about their children's fears and anxieties. How can parents minimize fears that are now causing more harm than good? Our esteemed guest today on Pathways is Luvmour, one of the developers, along with his wife, Dr. Josette Luvmour, of Natural Learning Relationships. This is a whole child understanding of childhood development that supports optimal well-being. Is a renowned specialist in child development, family relationships, and education. He has led hundreds of seminars and appeared at national and international conferences to share his vision on how children organize their world and how we can create relationships that bring forth optimal well-being. The co-founder of Summa Institute and author of Optimal Parenting, he has a master's degree in psychology of education at UC Sonoma State. His master's thesis was on spiritual philosophy and education with an emphasis on practitioners, such as Montessori, etc. Has taught in universities as well as K through 8. Until recently, he has served as headmaster of Summa Academy. His natural learning relationships system, the developmental approach which is used at Summa, is also the core approach of 3 other schools and has influenced countless others. In the fall of 2017, he and Josette will be featured presenters at an International Holistic Education Conference in Ashland, Oregon. On May 10th, 2017, and coming up soon after this interview airs on KBOO, along with Josette, will be hosting an event here in Portland entitled Fear, the Enemy of Education, 7 Ways Fear Undermines Learning and What You Can Do About It. And that's what we're going to focus on Pathways today. Hello, and welcome to the Pathways program.
Thank you, and thank you for that lovely introduction.
Well, why don't we start off with a little bit of background? First of all, there's your school, the Summa Academy, but you also have the Summa Institute and a research arm. Can you sort of give us a diagram of all of this?
Sure. Well, the Institute is the parent organization, and it has three aspects: the Academy, as you say, the research arm, and the Professional Development Center. And it's through the Professional Development Center that we give talks in the community, appear at conferences, and train other teachers and educators and social service workers and even doctors and lawyers on how children see the world and how when they interact with children, they can bring forth the best.
Now, today's conversation, which points to your upcoming lecture, has a backstory that you were telling me goes back some 40 years. Can you tell us about that?
Well,
fear, the enemy of education.
I know what you mean. Thank you. I have been thinking about this for many, many, many years, and in my 20s, really, I was an independent scholar, and I would consider deeply questions around consciousness and education, as well as doing my own inner work. And I would write essays, not so much for public consumption, but to help me clarify my own thoughts and bring them forward. And I wrote in one of those essays about education and about fear, and I named specifically, fear is the enemy of education. However, as life unfolds and so many different pathways become available to us, I hadn't really looked or thought about that essay for many, many years. I couldn't even find it now. But when we were looking very deeply at the question of there's so much information about how to bring forth well-being in children now. There's good stuff from brain research. Our work in human development is at the forefront of these questions. And yet we notice many, many times parents like it, but they can't quite actualize it. And so we started to ask, what's in the way? And no matter which way we looked, we see what we call unnecessary fears blocking this opportunity to really just engage our children from the way they see the world, to participate in the unfolding of their life and destiny rather than trying to control it and manipulate it. And so we thought perhaps we're missing something if we don't directly address the fear.
Now, fear is a part of life. Everybody has fears arise. We're a nervous species. I like to say primates are a nervous species. They're also very curious. That's the other side of it. But what's qualitatively different now? I remember when I was a kid in school in the 60s, I remember hiding under my desk during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes and no. The overemphasis on perhaps what are legitimate fears, such as physical safety, is one aspect where we should be certainly concerned with it, but we overemphasize it really sometimes to the point of creating fear about the fear itself. And we see many unnecessary fears. For instance, do we ask ourselves, when should competition be introduced to children? What is a third grader going to do when he or she compares their work with someone else's? How does that resonate in them? What happens when children feel their parents striving for achievement that they're perhaps not ready for just yet? Or really that achievement notion is driven by a school or by an educational approach that hasn't really accounted for the way children learn and the opportunities that we have in learning.
So you're talking in that case about the fear of failure or the fear of not keeping up or the fear of falling behind, which normal education seems to foster through its competitive orientation. But at Summa, you guys have personalized learning systems. Does that get around this problem?
It does, in many ways. But it gets around that particular problem about comparing children one with the other. But there's a really deeper issue here, and that deeper issue is, where does the fear of failure live in us? How does it arise? And what happens, and this is perhaps the most critical question, what happens when we're continually in an environment where there's subtle, what we might feel as grinding fears? Did I please my parents? Did I please my educators? Might the teacher report me for something? What about my need to have interpersonal dialogue with my classmates? How does all this kind of grinding, underlying fear that's, as you say, so pervasive in our culture, how does that register in a child? And I think the first place that we can and should look is all the great research done in the brain and how that's happened.
And what happens to our brain on fear or under the influence of this pervasive anxiety?
What happens is the brain starts releasing different chemicals and that get us, if it's a dramatic fear, which is a necessary fear, someone's coming at you, then you go to just hits of cortisol, adrenaline, and then your system is in that chemical trajectory for quite some time, depending on the threat. But the subtle grinding fears have us continually releasing pre-adrenaline inducing chemicals. And this is so scary. What happens is the amygdala and the hippocampus, which are in the limbic system, in the midbrain, start to be dramatically compromised. And those places are the source in which we process memories. So if I want to learn something, and I organize, and we know this for a fact, we organize most of our memories around the emotional content, not the data content. And the emotional content has this fear attached to it. Then there's going to be this constant state of tension and this constant state of I'm on edge. And we don't learn well when we're on edge, and we won't remember. What we'll remember is the fear associated with the learning,
Right.
rather than a joy and openness and a curiosity associated with the learning.
So it's easy for me to see how this is a problem with most educational systems, public schools, etc., because there's very little attention paid to the emotional aspect of the situation, and it's all of the emphasis is on the content and on, learning and memorizing and, gathering facts. And you aren't we sort of taught to suppress our feelings and pretend or numb out to them? What happens?
Or compartmentalize them or put them aside and to achieve the goal. And that whole statement in it has a certain implicit fear. It's really challenging. The most schools are finally, and I say finally because I've been at this for 35 years, most schools are finally saying, oh, there is something called emotional intelligence, and they're doing what I feel are kind of beginning but quite superficial ways of engaging it. But Paul, I can't tell you, the most important thing to understand is that emotional intelligence is not separate from academic excellence. You can't have true academic excellence without support in emotional intelligence, because our brains organize around the information by its emotional content. So even in places where they're starting to notice emotional intelligence, they have it as separate. Let's do this over here on the side, or
Right.
Let's give the kids a chance to talk a little bit more or something. But fundamentally, it doesn't get into issues around relationship, around the nature of relationship, and the importance that has for learning.
So I can see how fear as a strong emotion can inhibit learning and impact memory. What are some other emotions that are antidotes to that?
Well, I mean, we don't really, it's not so much an antidote approach as it is to create, and to this I have just so much homage to Carl Rogers, who said it really clearly. A fully functioning human is connected to all their emotional states and has the opportunity to express those in ways appropriate to the world they're in. But if you're taught to compartmentalize or suppress, then you're not in touch with the emotional qualities of your life, and so it doesn't come forward in a way that's going to maximize the use in the world.
So you're talking about Carl Rogers, about being comfortable with feelings, with emotions, and yet when you talk about the effect of fear on personal development or spiritual growth or socialization, you're talking about the fears that don't get processed, the fears that are suppressed because they make us uncomfortable. Or
that they can't come forward in the environment when there's hierarchies and punishments. And
so can you give an example of where a better, more intelligent, more enlightened approach to education gives an opening for that to happen that doesn't disrupt the whole educational process?
Sure, but it won't disrupt it. In fact, it'll enhance it. And what we do at Summa Academy and many of the places that we've influenced. First, we create literally opportunities during the day through activities, through exercises, and through straightforward conversation to really allow the students to express what is going on for them. This one child has a nervous tic. Well, that would usually go unseen, or that child would be told to be quiet. But we'll say, hey, is anyone influenced by that? We want to take the stigma out of the tic. We all have different habits that influence one another, and that's where the conversation goes. Whoa, so that is interrupting your learning somewhat. Well, we don't want that. So what kind of communication can we have around that? How can two people or as a class organize themselves so that that isn't suppressed and yet learning isn't disrupted? And kids are tremendously capable of dealing with that, of coming
You
to
mean
solutions.
the other kids or the one?
The other kids, yeah. And, or the educator. We call our teachers educators because education
Okay, so you
to
got
bring
emotional
forward.
intelligence arising on several fronts here. There's the kid who's got the tic.
Right.
There's the classmates that learn to be tolerant.
Or find some other way to deal with it. Maybe a particular classmate needs headphones in that particular moment to just cancel out the sound. But there's nothing wrong with the tic. There's nothing wrong with feeling that's an interruption. And if that is allowed to come forward, then the relationship among those students as well as with the educator is enhanced. And I have to say one other thing about the brain. We know from the field of interpersonal neurobiology that we deeply influence each other's architecture of our brains, architecture through relationship. Now, if those young people and that educator come to some place in relationship where they're really supportive of each other, that is so meaningful in terms of our species, in terms of just life.
Right. I think it's beautiful that your educational philosophy and the institutions that you've influenced and founded are so attuned to the integral importance of emotional intelligence, to the matrix of all different kinds of intelligence and the relationship between that and learning. I know when I went to school there was no emphasis on emotional intelligence at all. The term hadn't even been coined yet. And I learned how to get all A's, how to excel at testing. I never retained diddly.
Right.
Because I didn't care about that.
Right.
I didn't have
an
emotional...
stuff in your short-term memory, like when the classic all-nighters in college or something, and nobody retains anything because the emotion associated with the learning was fear or tension. And we're not going to sit here and go, oh, let me remember my tensions. That's a great way to live. You'll remember more your joys. If you remember your fears, it'll be more a trauma-type remembrance.
So, is public school getting any better at this?
I'm not an expert on public school. I know some instances. I know some of the work being done up at Jefferson High, for example, is towards this, if you will. Mm-hmm. But I can't comment on public schools.
And well, you can maybe have an opinion on how schools generally use fear as a motivator.
I can, and it's unfortunate, and the standardized testing and the core curriculum and the hierarchy of this school and the lack of tolerance for the wide range of emotions that we live and breathe all create this undertone of fear.
Well, okay, so now let's get to the process of getting free from fear, which you're going to go into in your talk, I'm sure. I hope.
Yes, absolutely.
And you say we don't have to live with unnecessary fears. Right. How do you define unnecessary fears?
Well, as we said, an unnecessary fear is a fear where you've piled on, or you've piled on a fear. So you're feeling there's a feeling of unsafety. Safety has to be guaranteed in a school or a home.
Right.
But then we're constantly going, are we safe? Are we safe? Are we safe? That's an unnecessary fear. Creating infrastructures in schools and testings and just, is my kid going to be okay? And all those things are unnecessary fears, especially when we understand how to develop relationships that bring forth well-being in children.
You know, we all have this problem, it seems to me. Everybody, not everybody, I shouldn't generalize too much, but everybody I know is dealing with unnecessary fears in the sense of, you know, having this fight or flight response to things that are not an immediate danger by any means, things that are just thoughts that we have in our head, right, or old stories or catastrophizing, that kind of thing. You say that we need to communicate with friends and partners about this kind of thing and bring it out of the shadow.
Yes, absolutely.
And this is for adults as well as with our children.
That's primarily for adults.
So what's a good way to start a conversation like that?
to name your fear.
Okay,
To say, okay, wow, I'm worried that we're not going to have enough money. I'm worried that our child won't get into a good college. I'm worried that my students won't do well on standardized testings, and therefore my credibility as a teacher will be negatively impacted. So we can talk about these things and bring them out, and in the conversation, they'll find their proper place in our makeup. Right now, they have an outsized place in our makeup, and we start mobilizing to protect against them. But in conversation, we might find strategies that help, but we find what you just said. Hey, we can share in this, and in sharing in this, we can keep a much better perspective than our thoughts run wild.
So we give ourselves a chance to see through the seeming urgency or critical nature of some thought that occurred to us, like, oh my God, my kid's never gonna, or, you know.
Right.
So we have all of these fears and anxieties about we want the best for our children. And they come from stuff that we probably learned from our parents, or that we bore the brunt of as young children ourselves.
And it's endemic in our society, Paul.
Right. And how important is it to understand how this fear developed and took hold inside of oneself?
Well, it's very important, and I don't know that we have time in our interview today, but one of the things we'll go into in the talk, it's going to be a dialogue on May 10th, is what we call emotional metabolism. And just as we have a physical metabolism, we have an emotional metabolism. And how did ours develop? And once we understand our emotional metabolism, we can, just like we change our physical metabolism through diet, exercise, etc., we can change our emotional metabolism. But we have to know it. We've been not even taught to recognize it.
Well, that sounds like an important skill, awareness. You know, I've often said when it comes to different personal growth modalities, different therapies, it seems to me that awareness is always at least 80% of the solution.
It is, but and awareness informed is really 95% of the solution.
Right. Well, that's just greater awareness, right?
Yes, it's greater awareness, but we can see into how our emotional makeup developed. We can see into how we came to have these unnecessary fears.
Now, your educational approach at Summa and what you teach through the Institute involves parents more than usual, a lot. Can you sort of summarize that?
Yes. Well, we call it the Bridge Program, but in the Bridge Program, it's not just let's have a cake sale or let's organize this event. What we're really doing is looking at the depths of how children organize their world, child development, and very importantly, and Josette's great contribution, is what happens to us as educators, as parents, as grandparents, if we meet those really profound natural developmental needs of our children, and the results are spectacular. We grow, when we talk about awareness, our awareness, it opens up because we're on the side of the natural unfolding of children and we see how it is, and it helps us rebalance deeply in ourselves.
So Josette, who's a PhD, wrote this book, Grow Together.
Yes.
So it's kind of a new book about the benefits for adults who make intentional efforts to nurture their children.
Yes. And we've had private practice for 35 years, Paul. And the first thing I tell people when they come in is, if you want the cheapest way home to remedy whatever may be the dysfunction you're experiencing, just simply provide for the natural needs of children. Because by doing so, you'll heal so many of your childhood wounds.
So how does Summa Academy help kids communicate with the adults in their lives?
Well, how does Summa help kids communicate with adults, by encouraging them to speak what's really true for them. By them, you don't really have to teach that to children. What you have to do is actually keep out the negative influences.
Just allow
You
it.
have to acknowledge that their feeling qualities, their emotional qualities, and their intellectual qualities are so important, and to bring that forward. You create an environment in which telling the truth is great, and there's no punishments involved in that. You have a system of restorative justice where, when there's an issue, really profound, deep conflicts within a school, the movement is to restore justice in all the people, and then they can bring that home to their families and their siblings.
And to have respect for feelings, to have respect for the whole arena of emotional intelligence, and how everybody has a right to feel whatever they're feeling.
Yes, and then, of course, to provide really good academic work for the kids,
Right.
for the students, so that the parents are so happy to talk to them.
Okay, so we're running out of time. Let's talk about your event in Portland on May 10th.
May 10th.
A week after this show is broadcast on KBOO. It's entitled Fear, the Enemy of Education, 7 Ways Fear Undermines Learning and What You Can Do About It.
Yes.
I'll just go ahead and give the information. It's at the Multnomah Friends Meeting House at 43rd and Southeast Stark on Wednesday, May 10th at 7 p.m. That's Fear, the Enemy of Education, an event with a $20 suggested donation.
I just want to say that this is not an infomercial for Summa. This is for all parents, all educators, everyone who has concern and understanding of the way to bring forth the greatness in children. It's not an infomercial for Summa. You've asked about Summa. I really appreciate it. But this is going to be directly on fear and the issues we all face.
So this is just a work of passion on your part.
Yes, my life with children is a work of passion.
Beautiful. Well, thank you. There's so much more we could explore, but we have run out of time today. And I want to make sure to tell people about your website.
Well, SummaAcademy.org will have the information. We'd really love it if you became friends with Summa Academy on Facebook. There's no particular website just dedicated to this talk, but you can find all the information there.
Well, I'm so glad that you're doing this talk. Fascinating subject. I'm going to be there, and I hope a lot of our listeners show up too, because this is the kind of discussion that needs to happen in a community, in my opinion, and I'm grateful that you've been on the show today and that you're doing this event.
I am too, so thank you so very, very much.
And for those who tuned in late, this is your Pathways host, Paul O'Brien, author of Great Decisions, Perfect Timing, a book that shares the theme of Pathways, which is personal and cultural evolution. Today we have been visiting with Josette Luvmour, founder of the Summa Academy and Summa Institute, and talking about an event being put on by the Summa Institute coming up. I want to say thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into the Pathways program, which is broadcast and streamed via KBOO.FM Sunday mornings at 8:30 a.m. USA Pacific Time. Podcasts of today's show, which you can listen to and forward to others, are also available for free at divination.com. That's spelled D-I-V-I nation.com, as well as via iTunes and other podcast servers. This is Paul O'Brien reminding you to tell your friends about Pathways Radio and podcasts. And thanks again to Josette Luvmour and to all of you listeners for tuning in and being a part of the Pathways experience.